this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. The usual historical narrative of the U-boats during World War II revolves around the Battle of the Atlantic and the struggle over the convoys bringing vital supplies to Britain. But the story of the U-boat war is much more complex. They went into action on the first day of hostilities with Britain and France and operated in nearly every theatre of operation in which the Wehrmacht served, and within all the Southern Ocean. To discuss the global U-boat war, I'm joined by Lawrence Paterson. Lawrence is the author of The U-Boat War, A Global History, 1939-45. Lawrence, thanks for joining me. As ever with the Second World War, it's interesting to start with World War I. I think I'm right in saying that the Germans were barred from having U-boats after the First World War. So did they carry on developing them in secret?
Well, it was illegal under the Versailles Treaty to have any U-boats or work on U-boats, or they had a very limited navy, no aircraft, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, there was a lot of covert development between the wars, but particularly from sort of the late 20s and so on. The Reichsmarine at the time, they formed this little sort of cover company, if you like, led by this guy who invested a black fund of sort of hidden money in this, that, and the other. And they started developing U-boats essentially for other nations, in other nations, in Finland and Sweden and so on. I actually knew one of the guys, a guy called Hans Rudolf Ersing, who was involved in creating U-boats for Finland. And these were with an eye to repopulating the German Navy at some point, because it says something that, when Hitler actually came out in 1935 and repudiated the Versailles Treaty and announced that we're going to have a Navy and all this kind of stuff, within a few weeks they'd launched their first U-boat. So people must be going, now, where was that? How did they manage that? So yeah, there was a lot of interwar development, although the funny thing is, the U-boats of the Second World War are really direct relatives of the same designs from the first, just slightly improved, if you like. Yeah, really direct lineage. They even look similar, some of them do anyway. And the whole principles of it were already in place from the First World War, because the First World War U-boats were actually far more effective than the Second World War U-boats. It's
an extremely clever way of getting around the restriction of not having U-boats by just building them for other people. Yeah, but they were doing the same. The Luftwaffe was busy sort of recreating itself too. And Ernst Heinkel, he had a little factory hidden in some sand dunes, and all these inspectors would go around looking for it, and they'd get sort of shoved this way and that. And Japanese ambassadors, or not ambassadors, but diplomats, were sort of funneling them in the right directions. And then they gave up and sort of started doing it in Russia and so on. So yeah, the whole German military was sort of re-engineering itself quietly. Yeah. So you say the U-boats was more successful really during the First World War. But I was going to say, when they're thinking about how they're going to use the U-boats in the Second World War, are they building on tactics and strategy from the First World War, or have they taken it all to bits, rethought it all, when actually we need to do this and not that?
Yes and no. During the First World War, U-boats operated independently, and the commander of the U-boats in the First World War, a guy called Bauer, he came up with the idea of a collective offense sort of organized by a control U-boat, one of the big sort of transport U-boats equipped with radio equipment and all this kind of stuff, so that they could unify boats in single attacks. But of course, most of the targets for most of the war were independent sailing merchant ships. So there was no need for a sort of cohesive wolf pack as we now know it. Sort of strategy. And then when Germany, they tried their sort of unrestricted campaign, they sort of dabbled in it a couple of times, but they really unleashed it in 1917, because they knew that they had to get stuck in and get it sorted out before America could join the war and all this sort of thing. And they were facing the privations in Germany because of the British blockade of Germany. It was really starting to bite, and they had to either do something drastic or give up, basically. So they announced the unrestricted campaign, and it was wildly successful. They sank tons and tons of shipping. The most ships ever sunk by U-boats in either war was during that 1917 campaign. And the British responded by finally sort of grouping their ships together in convoys, and that defeated the individual U-boats. And this is when Bauer's idea said, well, let's do the same with the U-boats. And they sort of said, nah, let's not. So it was sort of an idea that was floated out there. And one of the U-boat commanders at the time in the Mediterranean was Karl Dönitz. And he was very impressed with this idea, and he remembered it. And so it's sort of an indirect extension of ideas already formed in the First World War. But Dönitz was the first guy to actually apply it.
Dönitz becomes head of the U-boat fleet during the Second World War. Now, he estimates, is it before the war, that they need 300 U-boats in the event of war? Have I got that right?
Yeah, essentially, yeah, because he had a rule of thirds. 1/3 of your U-boats need to be on station. 1/3 need to be traveling to or from their combat zones, and 1/3 in the shipyards undergoing repairs and all this kind of stuff. And to take on a nation like Great Britain, not only with its incredibly powerful navy and all this kind of stuff, but the amount of shipping they would need to sink, he would need 100 U-boats on station. So therefore, he'd need 300 total. And he started the war with 57. And of those 57, the majority were small Type 2 coastal boats, which were only really suited for going into the North Sea. And they carried a very limited torpedo load and all this kind of stuff. So it's interesting. I was just working on a manuscript of a book written by a guy called Victor Uhren, who I might be pronouncing his name wrong there, but that's how I call it, Victor Uhren. And he was one of Dönitz's staff officers. He was a U-boat commander, but he pre-war and later on during the war. But he was one of his staff officers, and he remembers when war with Britain was announced, and Dönitz, he was really shocked, and he stormed out of the room, slammed the door behind him, and all this kind of stuff. And then when he came back in, he recovered his composure, and he'd sort of said, right, we're going to do this. We have weapons to do this. But talking to him after the war, he knew they couldn't win. In the same way that Erich Raeder, who was the head of the entire German Navy at that time, basically said all they could hope to do is die with honor, because Hitler had promised them there'd be no war before 1944.
Was there a massive U-boat building plan already in place by then, or is it kind of just a plan to build a lot of U-boats?
No, there was a plan to build a balanced fleet. Most of the German Naval High Command failed to see the power of the U-boat because they had failed in the First World War. Yeah, the unrestricted campaign sank a lot of ships, but ultimately failed. It didn't win the war for them. Because they had failed, there was this mistaken belief by both the British and by some German naval officers that U-boats had been bested. That they were now redundant due to things like ASDIC, sonar, all this kind of stuff, and British convoying and escorts and blah, blah, blah. And the British mistakenly believed that as well. They thought, it's not that much to worry about because we know what to do. Dönitz was always pushing and pushing and pushing for more. We need more U-boats. This is the only weapon with which we can really do this. And he was quite a junior officer in the Navy in comparison to all the admirals and so on. And they just basically told him to go away. And they wanted a balanced fleet. They were building battleships, and there was an aircraft carrier under construction. And U-boats were seen as a part of that. They were seen as a reconnaissance vehicle, as go out and find the enemy fleet. And, there they are. And it was completely unrealistic because the German fleet wasn't really equipped for a proper commerce war, even though, by the time it opened up, the major sort of surface ships ended up going into the Atlantic as raiders, like the Graf Spee and all this kind of stuff. But no, the U-boats weren't given the priority until it was too late. And even in the early stages of the war, when Raeder said, we're at war now. Oh, no, maybe we should build more U-boats. Dönitz, he kept pushing for a particular type of U-boat. He said, we need this one. And they said, no, you keep quiet, So he wasn't even given the sort of the voice to be heard until, it was well underway. And really, the reality is Germany lost the initiative right from the off. I mean, this is kind of imagery of, the wolf packs romping their way through Allied convoys right from the word go. It's just not true, with one or two rare exceptions.
Well, let's look at those rules, because they actually start the Second World War with internationally agreed rules of engagement for submarines. It's not it's not free for all, is it? I mean, do you want to tell us about the rules of engagement for a submarine, which sounds so, I don't know, anachronistic, doesn't it? We have gentlemanly rules of engagement, how we could use our submarines.
That's it. They had to abide by prize rules, where basically a U-boat had to surface, right? Had to fire a warning shot over the bow of an enemy. This is dealing. It's not dealing with military ships. It's dealing with commerce, right? Fire a warning shot. Then they had to inspect the manifest of the ship and decide: is this contraband? Is it enemy material? And if so, then the crew should be taken to a place of safety, which the Germans interpreted as a lifeboat. And given directions to land, which they did. And then the vessel could be sunk. And you sort of think, well, that's not going to work, is it? Because over half of the U-boats were so small that they had a 20 millimeter sort of pop gun to do their sort of the warning shots, and they were incredibly delicate. One touch of an enemy ship, if an enemy ship tried to ram, or the British were defensively arming merchant ships, one touch on that pressure hull and you're stuffed, really. So it was a sort of it was never going to really work, and it quickly changed by sort of January 1940, basically it was unrestricted campaign around the UK. In the first few months of the war, the U-boats were even forbidden to attack French ships, because there was this idea that the French might sort of not really go to war. They declared war, but they might back out of it. So don't touch the French ships. And U-boat commanders are going, it's nighttime. There's a bunch of ships in front of me. How do I know which ones are French? So it was a bit sort of, they were operating with one hand tied behind their back.
Even right at the start, though, is it the SS Athena?
Athena.
Oh, is it almost on the first day of that gets sunk by accident, which breaks the rules of war right from the very beginning? One
of the first ships attacked turns out to be a passenger steamer, because the guy in command of U-30 at the time, Fritz Lemp, he was a really well-respected commander. He was an experienced seaman. He'd sailed with his crew during the Spanish Civil War, not as a covert sailing, as part of an international, inverted commas, peacekeeping kind of thing. He knew his stuff. He was a good commander, and he thought it was an armed merchant cruiser, which made it a legitimate target. It was zigzagging, and he said it was darkened and so on. So he sank it without warning, because he believed it was a military target. You can do so. And of course, he was completely wrong. Again, I knew the radio man from that boat, and he was the one who actually picked up the kind of, attacked by submarine and sinking sort of message. And they just went, uh-oh. And then he compounded the issue by leaving. He didn't stay and help. He didn't sort of, make sure people were evacuated, anything like that. He just sort of snuck away. And the war diary, the BDU, the U-boat High Command War Diary, was altered for one of the very few times this actually happened. So it was sort of taken out and not mentioned. But yeah, so that they started really badly because it had shadows of the Lusitania written all over it, So yeah, it didn't go well.
Yeah, that's what I was sort of thinking of. The Lusitania spins so well for the Allies in many respects during the First World War. So that summer of 1940, I think that's the first happy time, and it's seen as, it tends to be popularly seen as being a considerable success for the U-boats in the Atlantic. How good was it for the Germans?
Not as good as popular legend would have it. You did have some spectacular successes. I'm not saying that there weren't, and I'm also not diminishing the horror of being in a convoy and being one of only perhaps two ships torpedoed, out of nowhere, and you're going down in flames and people die, and it's horrific, But apart from a very small number of successfully sort of orchestrated convoy attacks, by and large, it was nowhere near as successful as popular legend would have it, because there just weren't enough boats at sea to do what Dönitz wanted. He'd sort of like, oh, fantastic. Okay, we've got really good intelligence. There's a convoy here. We think we know where it is, which was another major problem, But they were focusing at that time on the choke points of traffic. They weren't way out into the Atlantic, So, okay, we think we know fantastic, throw every boat at it. Oh, we've got three. That was his problem right from the get. He didn't have enough boats. But what he did have was a lot of commanders who had really spent peacetime learning their craft. And that's where your famous people like Otto Kretschmer, Gunther Prien, Joachim Schapke, and all these sort of the aces of the time, they became famous or infamous depending on your point of view, because they were very daring, because they had rehearsed this time and time again in the North Sea. Like Kretschmer, for example, he would, they'd all try and do this, but he was sort of famous for it. He would penetrate inside a convoy. He'd slip under the escorts because there weren't enough escort vessels for the British, compounded by losses at Dunkirk and all this sort of thing later on. He'd slip inside the convoy and actually fire from inside the convoy on the surface, which is how U-boats were designed to be used. They're designed to be used as a surface attack craft, not a submerged attack craft. And he'd sort of boom, 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 fire off all his torpedoes, and then whoosh, he'd be gone. And he was spectacularly successful, but that was quite a rarity. And he himself is a guy who, right up until the day he died, was always derisive about this idea that there was ever a happy time for the U-boats, because they were suffering casualties right from the word go. This vision of it being totally one-sided is not particularly accurate, nor is the vision of it being stunningly successful, nearly bringing Britain to its knees. It sort of, if you look at the statistics, which are always very dry, and it doesn't sort of paint a picture of a burning ship, but the reality is it was nowhere near achieving what it wanted to do. But that was probably the most successful time, but it's largely mythological.
In some respects, it's a proper propaganda success for the Britain to galvanise a country.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, definitely.
And it's that propaganda we remember, we live with. It's so pervasive in Britain that it's still popular legend.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in some ways, the German U-boats of the Second World War were still feeling the effect of propaganda generated by the previous war. Straight away, once the U-boat started to sort of bite or be perceived as sort of biting, and then there was this idea it's U-boat infested seas, and there's two guys sort of puttering around looking for people, once that sort of got in people's minds, then the images of the First World War were flooding back, and there you go, and Churchill famously sort of said the only thing that ever frightened me during the war was U-boat peril, and fair enough to be frightened of it, but in actual fact, it wasn't going to do it, and it didn't do it.
Yeah. So and again, there's a wonderful book. I've forgotten the title again. There's a wonderful book about Hitler writing his war memoirs. It's massive, but the point is, Churchill writing his war memoirs.
Oh, Churchill, yeah. The other guy.
Churchill writing his war memoirs. And the point is, he gets out so quick after the war that his history of the war becomes the official history of the war, which puts him at the centre of it. So when he says the only thing that worried me was war in the Atlantic, everyone goes, "Oh, okay," and then builds on that, and and off it spins in its own way. So the fall of France for Britain. Actually, the centre of the war, the gravity of the war, moves to the Mediterranean and North Africa, which is not something we hear about in a U-boat campaign. Everything U-boats is Atlantic, but I presume they're also operating within the Atlantic. I'm sure there's some film somewhere. You'll be able to tell me which film has U-boat commanders in the Mediterranean.
Well, Das Boot, they try to get through the Straits of Gibraltar to get to the Mediterranean, and they end up sort of grounded on the bottom of the Straits and abort the attempt. That's probably the most famous one. But Dönitz was always against sending boats into the Mediterranean, because he was in the Mediterranean in the First World War and he got sunk. So he probably remembered that. But also it was away from, I think the German word is Schwerpunkt, which I think is lovely, isn't it? It's like the center of gravity of his operations was the Atlantic, and certainly in the beginning was the North Atlantic. And he had so few boats, he didn't want to divert anything to the Mediterranean, which he felt was really unsuitable for U-boat operations, and at that stage, peripheral. And he was right. The Italians sort of got kicked about a bit by the British, obviously. So Hitler sent in what became the Africa Corps, and Dönitz, in my opinion, sort of rightly considered that the Africa Corps and a sufficient Luftwaffe sort of presence would be more beneficial than sending U-boats in there. But obviously, sooner or later, he kept getting sort of requests, send support, and then he go, no, and then he got ordered basically send some U-boats in there. Every single bar one. There was one U-boat in the first few months of the war that went into the Mediterranean and left again. Every other U-boat that was transferred into the Mediterranean never reached the Atlantic again. They all either sunk or were scuttled in the Mediterranean. And when they went into the Mediterranean, they actually achieved remarkable success very quickly against the British Navy. They sunk, the Barham, they sunk the Ark Royal. They reduced the British Mediterranean fleet dramatically. This was sort of around the same period of time where Rommel was romping his way towards Egypt, and it all looked rather bleak. They started to sort of evacuate Alexandria and all this kind of thing. And then, as we know, basically Rommel just overextended himself dramatically. They never bothered to sort of take Malta, which was a major blunder. And that was the end of it. The irony is that Hitler then did, largely on his orders, he did what he so often did. He then reinforced failure. When Rommel could have done with supplies, when Rommel could have done with, Malta being attacked and taken rather than be left as an air and naval base, when Rommel could have done with troops, he didn't get it. And when he was being thrown back to Tunisia, all of a sudden he got reinforcements, half of which was sunk on the way there. And you just thought it's that classic thing of reinforcing failure, and the U-boats were just on the back foot right from that point onwards.
It was the U-boat bases in the Mediterranean, because obviously they occupied France as Italy, or do they have to come and go through Gibraltar?
They all entered through the Straits of Gibraltar, obviously, but they had a base in Toulon and Marseille in France. They had La Spezia, which is a major Italian naval base in northern Italy. They also had Salamis opposite Athens in Greece. What they didn't have was an island with a cave in it. That's in Indiana Jones. So people have this, they have this love of the idea that there are secret U-boat bases in, Mykonos or whatever. Go, no, there aren't. I wish there were, because that'd be awesome, but there aren't,
That would be fantastic. I never thought.
It would be, wouldn't it? Yeah, it'd be just great.
70s war film sort of thing going on to it. Are they tasked with the same mission in the Mediterranean as the Atlantic, or are they really tasked with trying to do something different because they're supporting a land campaign?
It's different, really. They were occasionally directed against merchant traffic, but the merchant traffic was so sporadic, and I mean, it's like they never took effective part in the Operation Pedestal against that or anything like that. Their task was really to operate and support the land campaign. As I say, they gave the Royal Navy a bit of a hard time for a while, which no doubt had an effect on the land campaign. But when they were sort of tasked with intercepting sort of troop transports that were running to and from Tobruk, for example, it was pretty much a failure, because you can't torpedo these shallow draft vessels that were being used. You can't find them half the time either. You're too close to land. So if you surface and attack them, you're in all kinds of trouble, because you had the Desert Air Force, you had aircraft from Malta and so on. So it kind of ended up being sink whatever you find, but it wasn't the cohesive sort of merchant campaign, which is what units needed. It was much more used against military targets. And, a few times they surfaced to shell refineries and things like that with not particularly great results. They landed a few Brandenburger teams and so on. And again, not with great results or anything, but yeah, so it was a classic sort of misdirection of meager U-boat strength. And as the U-boat numbers were actually increasing, more and more boats were being shoveled into the Mediterranean and achieved really not much. And then, of course, later in the war, when you had Operation Torch, and then you had the attack on Sicily and all this and Italy, they were completely ineffective and proved themselves incapable of intercepting an invasion force and operating successfully against it, with one or two rare exceptions. Again, they sunk the occasional ship, but they had no real effect on the land war in that way. Ironically, probably the greatest potential effect that U-boats could have had in North Africa was when a man called Achilles in U-161, I think it was, he sank a ship in the mid-Atlantic, which was headed from the United States to Morocco with 300 Sherman engines in it. And all of a sudden, he sank that ship and destroyed his engines. And the Allies were going, "Oh my God, we got all these tanks here, we got no engines." And they had to race another ship over with the same number of engines, and actually it reached there before the other one was scheduled to. So in actual fact, he worried them, but it didn't have a direct effect. It could have, but it didn't.
It's sort of where actually they're not commerce raiding directly in the Med, which is perhaps where they're at their strength.
Yeah. And in the Mediterranean, there was a lot of Allied air power. Once the Allies had got the upper hand, a lot of Allied air power, a lot of bases. The water can be quite savage in the Mediterranean, but it can also be very calm and very transparent. So you have to be properly deep before people can't see you. In the Atlantic, not so much. You can go down, a few meters and you're invisible. It was a bad idea.
Now, they're also operating off the west coast of Africa. And am I right in saying that some of those were the most highly successful missions of the war, again, which we never hear of?
Yeah, the three most successful missions of World War II were off West Africa. Including the voyage to and from, obviously, but they attacked a shipping sort of centered around Freetown, in Sierra Leone. And Gunther Hessler, I think I'm correct in this. He was the man that had the most successful mission in World War II, and it was that area. Again, it was sort of Dönitz withdrew his U-boats from the North Atlantic temporarily, really quite early in the war, because they were suffering casualties. They weren't able to find the enemy, so on and so on. And he sort of had this strong desire to send U-boats further south. So he sent these long-range Type 9 U-boats, which aren't really suitable for convoy raiding. They're too big and cumbersome for the rough and tumble against escorts and all this kind of stuff. He sent them off West Africa, and they had a good old time for a little while. And then, of course, by extension, later in the war, he sent them all the way down to South Africa, which he really wanted to do. And the first attempt failed. The second attempt was, again, really successful, and into the Indian Ocean around Madagascar really upset the Allies quite a lot. Didn't have a massive bearing on the course of the war, if you like, but sank a lot of ships. So Africa, the African sort of campaigns were at that stage more successful than any operations in the North Atlantic. It's
a bit like the auxiliary cruisers, those armed. When they pop up where nobody's expecting them, they're wildly successful, and then they disappear again. That's sort of their strength. But when you know that they're just going to be in the Atlantic, you can defend against it. But when they randomly pop up, I mean, it must have been a hell of a surprise to see them in the Indian Ocean.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's funny you mention that, because those auxiliary cruisers were essential for the long distance southern raiding U-boats, because they provided fuel, refueling capacity and restocking with provisions and so on. And of course, good old Enigma being penetrated, the Allies sank them all. So that created something of a problem. And in the Indian Ocean, because eventually U-boats went to Penang in Malaya and were based there. Now, these U-boats were carrying things for the Japanese, like materials and blueprints and all this kind of weapons plans and stuff like that, and zinc and alloys and so on. They ended up having a small base in Penang, and using a few ports over there and repair facilities in Japan and so on. And again, they were dependent on coming and going on refueling largely, and the Allies sunk those tankers too, because Enigma was penetrated. This is what people don't understand. U-boats, one popped up off New Zealand, took a shot at one ship off New Zealand and missed, and then couldn't find anything else worth sinking. So he totaled off, and I shouldn't laugh, it's terrible really. He sank a ship off Sydney, and that's actually the only ship sunk by U-boats in the Pacific. And then he went home, to Penang. And And his first watch officer was furious, actually, because he said, what are we doing? Why are we here? You know, this is ridiculous. We've come all this way to do what? You know, and he was quite right, really. It was sort of a...
Yeah, but I bet he didn't have quarters of the Navy around there to panic, having seen a U-boat.
Well, yeah. And, you know, the funniest thing is that the commander of that U-boat, Heinrich Timm, after the war, he was a naval commander in NATO. And there was an exercise somewhere, I'm not sure where it was, and there was a New Zealand naval officer there, and he was sort of saying, yeah, I went to New Zealand in my U-boat. I went ashore and I milked some cows and all this kind of, and that became commonly understood in New Zealand. Yeah, a U-boat actually reached here and people came ashore and we found a German prisoner and he had a ticket to a New Zealand film in his pocket and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, that sort of paranoia runs rampant, you know, even this was in 1944 that he did this, you know, but even then there's...
Oh, is it that late?
Yeah, it was really late in the war, you know, completely sort of futile, if you like, but it just causes that kind of, oh my God, the legend of the milking cows. That's brilliant.
You build on that with the common straighters. I think the common straigers were all over by then, weren't they? They by probably 42 or something, weren't they? But they caused, you know, they caused tremendous amount of panic. I imagine there's that, and I can't remember which one it is. 160 is it the Sydney?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, yep. And was it the Cormoran laid mines off New Zealand? And yeah, because was it the Cormoran that sunk the Sydney? Well, I was going to say kidney. That's not right. Is it?
I should have looked at it before. I didn't think we'd be going down auxiliary cruises. I always find them really interesting.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. It is fascinating. Yeah, I'm the same. I've got so many names bubbling around in my head. I sort of go, I think it was a Cormoran.
Or is it yeah. Anyway, whatever. We're deviated, but it is an interesting point how they operate absolutely miles from anywhere. But I was going to say, was it you mentioned the Japanese? Did they ever swap technologies with the Japanese? Because one thing that had occurred to me is obviously the Germans struggle with their torpedo technology, which is something the Japanese didn't do.
No, they had the long lance torpedo, didn't they? Spectacularly successful.
Which is superb. I just wondered if there's any cross-pollination of technology, which would have could have been a bit of a game changer.
There was patents for the long lance torpedo were actually given to the Germans, but in fairly late in the war, and by which time they'd finally started to figure out their problems, which were really caused by incredible mismanagement, you know. But the other problem was that you had there's a very strange relationship between the Japanese and the Germans in World War II, because they were allies, but both of them were inherently racist. So the Germans were, well, we're not going to build Japanese stuff, and the Japanese are sort of going, we don't need German rubbish, you know, and all this kind of thing. And I mean, yeah, they did dabble in other people's designs. I mean, the Japanese, I think, built a copy of the Messerschmitt 163 or something like that. I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, no, really, again, futile, you know, because the long lance was a fantastic torpedo, because the Americans suffered the same sort of problem in the Pacific. They had torpedo malfunctions. Yeah, so theoretically, yes, they did exchange all this information and all that kind of stuff, somewhat begrudgingly, but it wasn't really acted on.
I might have jumbled up our timeline. I was going to say, is the next attempt by the Germans to find a sweet spot where they're not going to be attacked when they move off the east coast of America, which is, I've forgotten the drumbeat, Operation Drumbeat.
Operation Drumbeat, Paukenschlag, yeah. That was once Hitler declared war on the United States, which stroke of genius. Dönitz, again, he sort of thought, right, let's get stuck in and send as many boats as we can. So he sent 6 because that's all he had. One of them had to abort its mission prematurely and was replaced. And there was a wave of supporting smaller U, because these were all long-range Type 9s that could reach the United States and go home. And he sent a bunch of supporting Type 7s, the medium boats, the ones that are made famous by Das Boot, which no one thought they had the endurance to kind of do it. And they went to Canada. And some of them actually made it as far down, I think I'm right in thinking, South Carolina, which was remarkable, you know. And then obviously later in the war, they realized if they can refuel to and from, then they were capable of going into the Caribbean. But yes, Operation Paukenschlag was designed to, you know, hammer merchant shipping off the United States East Coast, because Americans weren't grouping their ships into convoys, and there was a lot of economic pressure not to switch off the lights of the coastal resort towns and all this kind of stuff. So a lot of merchant ships were sort of puddling along, beautifully silhouetted, for these U-boats to attack, and they were very successful. But yet again, the actual, away from the fact that the U-boats came and torpedoed and then left without suffering any casualties, and away from the fact that, it must have been terrifying for the merchant shipping concern, the actual numbers were never going to, particularly put a dent in the United States. Far more successful than drumbeat was a separate attack after that into the Caribbean. And that was, again, long-range Type 9 U-boats who were targeting oil tankers from Venezuela, Operation Neuland. And that was the single most successful operation of the war. They went in and they were under orders to surface and launch a simultaneously attack by shelling these refineries, which was spectacularly unsuccessful. One boat, the poor guys and the gun crew, they're ready and they're on the surface and they load the shell and open fire, and they've forgotten to take the watertight tampion off the gun, so the barrel exploded and one of them was killed. So it was a disaster in that respect. But the actual attack on oil tankers was very, very successful and caused all kinds of problems for a brief period of time. There was a small shallow draft vessels coming from Venezuela, coming from the lake in Venezuela to Trinidad, were called the Mosquito Fleet. And the U-boat, they actually caused a mutiny amongst a lot of the crews in the Mosquito Fleet. They wouldn't sail because they were getting hammered by these U-boats. So again, that was way more successful than Paukenschlag and way more potentially effective, if you like. And then by extension, when U-boats started going into the Gulf of Mexico and attacking oil tankers there, not quite as successful, but it did force the Americans to really adopt convoying, to strengthen their air patrols and all this kind of stuff, and to pipe a lot of oil overland as opposed to using tankers, which was a bit more time consuming because they needed to get it sorted out. So that was quite a major worry for the United States Navy. It's famously reported that Admiral King, who was in charge, was not fond of the British. But in actual fact, the willingness of him to take British advice, I think, is greater than is commonly reported. He's commonly sort of known as no, I don't need to listen to you. It's not really true. I don't think so anyway. From what I sort of gather of it and looking at documents and stuff, he seems to sort of go, this is what we need to do. And it just took a little while to get organized. Once again, it was very successful, but it was launched by a really small number of U-boats. And actually the attack on the American East Coast was more successful in Canadian waters. There were two Type 9s went to Canada, supported by all these Type 7s, and they sank a lot of ships off Halifax and around that area before moving south into the United States waters. And then they basically ran out of torpedoes and had to go home.
There's an obsession with it. The idea of success by the U-boats is tonnage sunk. And actually, the problem is there's a lack of strategic vision than actually, go for the oil, go for... Yeah,
exactly. Specific targets. Potentially war-winning targets. Yeah, very much so. But Dönitz was waging what he thought was a commerce war, and it's a profit and loss sheet. It's like, we need to sink this much merchant tonnage to cause a problem to transporting supplies to Britain. That was his whole principle. It's a tonnage war. So, you add up the tonnage, and if you reach that magic mark, fantastic. We need to do the same thing next month, and it just didn't come to be, thank goodness, obviously, and usually was way, way shorter than that. And of course, once the United States enters the war, I mean, the game is just over. You're already at war in Russia. That ain't going to go well. And now you're taking on the greatest industrial power the West, who were pumping out Liberty ships and all kinds of stuff. And even though obviously the American strategic focus was very much in the Pacific, they didn't ignore the Atlantic, and Churchill managed to get that kind of, that thing from Roosevelt, Germany first and all this sort of stuff. And it changed everything. There was a sort of an undeclared war between the US Navy and Germany before the actual declaration was made, because the US Navy took over escorting duties to a certain part of the Atlantic, and these U-boats were sitting there sort of watching these Americans going, and then if they spotted the U-boats, they'd report them to the British, and the British would go after them. And then, of course, a couple of American ships were sunk. Merchant ship was sunk off Africa, and a couple of warships were torpedoed. One of which went down, the Reuben James, who used to know the commander that did that, Eric Topp. He sank that. And one time, USS Texas was right in front of this guy's torpedoes, and he was radioing permission to fire, but he wasn't allowed to. But there was very much an undeclared state of war even before it actually erupted with the Americans. And of course, once America joined in the war, there was a lot more power ranged against the U-boats, and then Brazil eventually entered the war against Germany, and that provided air bases and so on and so on, and it just got worse and worse and worse. So
you mentioned Russia. Now they were operating in the Black Sea, weren't they, U-boats? How did they get? Because weren't the Dardanelles closed? Yeah, no, they came overland. They came via. They were taken apart and put on barges and shipped down river, and then trucked across land to the Danube and put back in on barges, taken down to Romania, put back together, and voila, there you go, 6 U-boats. They did the same with the S-boats, Schnellboot, the German MTVs. 6 of them formed the 30th U-boat flotilla based in Romania. And again, they were operating largely in support of the land campaign, and not what you call spectacularly successful, but they made their presence felt. These are little Type 2 U-boats, sort of upgunned a little bit, and they did their best. They got to the stage where the direct effect they had was, as the Germans were advancing in various areas around the Crimea and so on, you had major Russian naval forces shelling Germans ashore. Well, the arrival of these U-boats sent them scuttling off the port. So, so it did have an effect. Again, the number of sort of ships they sunk is not particularly dramatic, but, they made their presence felt. And there were accounts of, these boats and Russian MTV sort of slugging it out on the surface and throwing things at each other, and, just really getting stuck in like old time pirates. It's amazing the efforts to drag them over land.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, to be fair, I suppose these 6 boats had been relegated to training duty, so it wasn't a drain on Dönitz' combat power elsewhere. But he must have wondered why the hell they'd bother. I mean, it was sort of, I can see why they were there, but in the grand scheme of things, bit of a waste of all that effort, as you say, a great deal of effort. He was really against U-boats going into the Arctic as well. He sort of said, no, this is futile sending them up there. It's just terrible conditions for all navies to operate. But once the PQ convoys started going across to Murmansk and everything, he was ordered to send more and more boats into the Arctic, who were by and large, again, really unsuccessful, with 1 or 2 rare exceptions. PQ-17 obviously springs to mind there, which was probably one of the better orchestrated combined U-boat Luftwaffe attacks of the war. Terrible for the Allies, but a brief success for the Germans. Yeah.
It's sort of the threat of them is almost disproportionate to actually what.
Yeah, very much so. Like the Tirpitz, isn't it? I mean, it was held in northern Norway and just sat there, being this kind of devious thing in the corner that everyone was terrified of, and got bombed. But that potential threat is it's certainly worth something strategically, for sure.
The bogeyman tying people down.
Yeah, exactly.
You've mentioned the Enigma Code a few times. Did the Germans ever realise or suspect that the radio traffic for the submarines was being read?
Yes. Yeah, they did. There were too many strange things happening the classic example, I can't remember exactly what the name of these islands are, but 3 U-boats were scheduled to meet way the hell out in the middle of nowhere in the central Atlantic, and a British submarine just happens to appear at this spot. And people are going, hang on a minute, and Dönitz asked for it to be investigated at least twice, I think. He sort of, I'm sure there's something sort of wrong with our codes, and to be fair, the guy in charge, the admiral in charge of launching these investigations, he went into it from a point of view that no one can penetrate this. And so he looked for information to validate his theory. And his main sort of thrust was that if the Allies had penetrated our Enigma codes, we would be losing more U-boats and we would be losing more ships and all this kind of stuff. And in that, it was ridiculous, because the Allies, they knew that if they went after every single thing, it would become obvious that they cracked the codes. But the very fact that convoys were being routed around U-boat patrol lines and all this kind of stuff, I mean, the commanders, they couldn't find the enemy. They disappeared. They were supposed to be there. Now they're not here. They know where we are, sort of thing. So there were many people who sort of thought, this can't be right. And then not only the actual penetration of the Enigma net, but the fact that kind of command and control that Dönitz had, whereby you're trying to orchestrate a line of U-boats, requires a certain amount of radio traffic, which, Allied direction finding was very sophisticated. And Otto Kretschmer, for example, the ace of World War II, who sank the most ships, who was captured in 1941, which shows you when the glory times of the U-boat sort of happened. He got the nickname Silent Otto, and people think it's because he was a very sort of quiet sort of man. It wasn't. It's because he didn't give radio signals unless he absolutely had to. And he said after the war, he said, I'm just convinced that we lost U-boats because of those damn radio signals, because they needed that kind of, that backwards and forwards to U-boat high command, because it wasn't like the First World War where you send a captain out and say, go and sink ships. They were constantly being redirected and moved around. And not only, you had the Enigma giving their positions away, but you had direction finding. And when the Allies could be confident that, we could attack this, and the Germans will think it's because of direction finding, they'd go for it. But the Allies were very savvy with the way they used their Enigma intelligence, really. A couple of times they, like that example I told you about, the 3 U-boats meeting, and they send in a British submarine. I think people in Whitehall were furious. They said, don't do that. It's too obvious. But even so, an inquiry was launched, and it was like, no, it's perfectly secure. There was a certain arrogance there. Just like throughout the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS, their signals were penetrated, long before the U-boats. They were the last one to really fall to the Allies. So, before the Battle of Alamein, Montgomery was sitting there going, I know exactly how many tanks he's got. I know how many liters of fuel he's got. I know where they are. Fantastic,
I mean, things like Enigma and cracking the code, the Allies are constantly working on and developing their technology. They have, as Dick, which I think the Americans is just sonar, isn't it? It's British. The Americans.
Oh, no, yeah.
Did U-boat technology work to counter this? It was
very reactive, and it was very, in my opinion, it was very haphazard as well. I don't want to get lost in this too much, but because I'll bore you to death. But there's 2 threads to it, really. There was a movement in the German U-boat service, powered by Dönitz, to develop new designs. The Volta submarine, which was hydrogen peroxide power and really maneuverable and all this kind of stuff. And then the electro boats, which actually did come to be at the end of the war, with massive sort of battery storage, so they could operate better underwater and so on. But a lot of these were reactive to Allied advances rather than leading the race, if you know what I mean. When the British developed sort of centimetric radar and put it in aircraft, the Germans, they didn't think they could do that. And then when they realized they came up with the Biscay Cross, which was basically 2 pieces of more or less plywood sort of nailed together in a cross with a wire wrapped around it, and it would beep every time it detected a radar signal. It was actually relatively successful in a rudimentary kind of way, but the cable went through an open hatchway, so you had to dismount this wooden cross, throw it down the hatch, it'd splinter and fall apart as everyone jumps down onto it. because the Allied aircraft come in at night time, And then there was a British prisoner of war from a bomber that had been shot down who basically said, "Oh, we actually home in on transmissions from your METOX," which wasn't true. And the Germans went, "Oh my God," so they gave that up. And the technological advancement of U-boats stopped, really. It was totally sort of reactive. Various radar detectors, various direction finding things. There was an idea, because they suffered massively from Allied air power, and so they thought, well, we'll stick loads and loads of flak weapons on a U-boat, and it's just not really, it's not a successful gun platform. It's not steady enough. They did bring down some Allied aircraft, not saying they didn't, but they even tried the flak boat, where they got a U-boat just covered in flak weapons to sail in amongst a group of U-boats and to lure the enemy in and then shoot them down. Well, it didn't work. They got hammered, absolutely hammered. And then once they realized that the Allies were starting to work in combining aircraft and surface forces, they just didn't have a counter for it, because they're surprised on the surface by an aircraft which has found them via radar. Okay, the aircraft circles around, sometimes just out of range of their guns. Okay, and if they want to dive, there's at least 30 seconds where they're completely vulnerable, and the aircraft can sort of zoom in and drop depth charges if they want to dive. If they stay on the surface, there's a destroyer on its way, and it's a bit like, so, you're in a bit of a pickle. So in many ways, that kind of lack of development doomed the U-boats to failure, because they were still fighting the war with essentially upgraded versions of the same designs that they entered the war with. They tried various torpedoes. Once they'd finally, by 1942, realized all the problems with their original torpedoes, they developed pattern running torpedoes. They developed the so-called destroyer killer, which homed in on military propeller frequencies and things like this. But the problem was that these U-boats they were forced largely to operate underwater. So the theory was you'd stand off much further than Dönitz had ever wanted his U-boats to do. Fire submerged. You'd fire your pattern running torpedoes, bound to hit something sooner or later, and it's just not as effective as they thought it was. In the same way that they'd fire a hunter-killer torpedo, against the destroyers, and because they homed on military propellers, they had to dive straight away, because these things sometimes circled, and then they're after the U-boat. So they'd fire, dive, and then they'd hear an explosion. They'd go, "Oh, we sunk it," but it hadn't. It could have been all manner of things, or it might have hit, it might not have. So you had massive sort of overclaiming as well, with people wishfully thinking that their torpedo attacks had worked. To me, it was all very reacting to Allied advances rather than leading the way. The Type 7, the classic U-boat, the one that's in the movies, and there's still one in existence in Kiel, which is fascinating. If you ever get a chance to go to a town near Kiel called Le Beau, there's one of these left, and it's incredible to walk through it. They had a pressure hull that the Allies didn't realize how well built this thing was. So their depth charges were set much lower than the U-boat could actually go. U-boats could reach really quite astounding depths. So they'd, if they were sharp enough, they'd get under the depth charges and creep away. But of course, then one was captured by the British. And in 1941, and they suddenly thought, oh, that's our problem. I see what the problem is now. We need to sort of change the depth settings on the depth charges. And, the British, they invented the squid, the hedgehog, they're constantly upgrading their radar. They belatedly sort of, threw effort into coastal command and so on. And the Americans joined all this. The Americans then developed the Fido, the homing torpedo, all this kind of stuff. And all those American carriers were going into the Atlantic and forming their hunter-killer groups. And it was just like, this isn't going to go well for Dönitz's men, and it didn't.
Well, it's a war of diminishing returns. How many of the original captains survived the war? There can't have been many.
Not that many. Although, I knew a couple of men who had actually served through the entire war, because the first sort of wave of captains, many of them were then put ashore. By 1941, if these guys have been fighting since 39 in particular, or even the year before, their nerves were shot. and they needed a rest. So a lot of them ended up in staff positions. Some of them stayed there, and they tended to be the ones who survived. But there's one man, Jürgen Ersten, who I knew, who was in U-61 for the opening of the war, then U-106 down in the South Atlantic. Then he went ashore, and it was actually he was in charge of the U-boats that attacked PQ-17. He was in a staff position. But then he came back into action and took a U-boat to the Far East. And he's one of the few that did survive, because some of these guys, that famous scene in Das Boot where they're having a party and a guy pulls out a gun and he shoots a hole in the wall at the very beginning, and they're all drunk and all this kind of stuff. I had lots of people sort of tell me, "Oh, that would never have happened." And reading this man, Victor Ern, reading his book, he talks about a guy called Engelbert Endras, who was a famous U-boat ace and who was the first watch officer for Gunther Prien when he went into Scapa Flow. Very experienced man, very well-respected guy, apparently a very nice guy, good commander, and he had his own boat. And he went in 1942, I think it was, he brought his boat back into France, and he got drunk and he pulled out his gun and started shooting at a chandelier, so it did happen. His nerves were absolutely shredded, and Dönitz sort of gave him a rocket and said, right, go out on patrol, go and do what you do best. So when you come back, we'll have to talk about the ramifications of this. And he never came back. Yeah, most of your first wave of, your famous commanders, Prien, Shepko, were all lost in action. Kretschmer was captured. The majority of the second wave of U-boat aces, if you like guys like Mutzelberg and Eric Top and Adi Schnee, they were very successful because there was still that period where the mid-Atlantic wasn't covered by Allied aircraft. So they were still not safe. That's way too exaggerating, but they, the odds weren't so heavily stacked against them. And then by the time these guys were either killed in action or moved ashore, the sort of the third generation of U-boat commanders, they were just up against it from the word go. And British statistics will actually show you as well that most U-boat commanders, actually the majority, never even hit a single ship. With a torpedo, there were a small amount who sank more than 10, but the majority of success from the U-boats cumulatively during World War II was achieved by people that, sank 2, maybe 3 ships in their entire career. By that later stage, by 1942-43, Dönitz finally had his 300 U-boats, but it was too late. They were outclassed by then. They were doomed to fail. You're reinforcing failure, but he knew that. He had the decision in May 1943. He basically evacuated his boats from the North Atlantic, and he had a decision to make whether to just basically call it off. Just forget it. This is futile, and he didn't because it's the right thing to do. He had to keep going, and what he said to Victor Ern early in the war, he said, all we can do is fight the best we can, because he really never believed they'd achieve what they set out to do right from the very beginning. Germany started a war it could never win. It was technologically unprepared. It was militarily unprepared, even though I think some of the German military formations on land, sea, and air were spectacularly militarily gifted, if you like. The middle management and the upper echelon of people, they were constantly at war with each other. Goering hated Raeder. Goering wouldn't let the Luftwaffe join in naval battles, no, they're my aircraft, all this kind of stuff. And that was a hallmark of Nazi Germany, because that's the way Hitler ruled, divide and conquer. He set people against each other. The SS was squabbling with the Wehrmacht for resources. The Navy was squabbling for resources from the Luftwaffe, and so on and so on, So it was a war they could never really win. I mean, which I say with the benefit of hindsight, obviously, which helps, doesn't it?
Hindsight's always a wonderful thing. Look, with the end of the war, we should leave it there. Thanks, Lawrence. If you, loyal listener, would like to know more about German submarines in World War II, Lawrence's book is The U-Boat War: A Global History, 1939-45. I will put a link on the website, www.podcast.com. If you have enjoyed this episode of the podcast, you can find me on Patreon. That's patreon.com/WW2podcast. $1 or so each month into the virtual tip jar from a listener like you helps me find the time to put the show together. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast. Next time, I hope we'll be looking at the Battle of the Bulge from the German perspective. But until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tongue, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.